Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. Every company has a story to tell, from the small startup to the large enterprise, and everything in between. This is one of them. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Marco,
Sean,
did you see that big thing floating down the river the other day?
the big thing floating down the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was the Log4j. Exactly.
Oh, it was a while back.
It was a while back.
That's the memory. It just trigged in my mind.
I think as soon as that term came out, some people shivered as they're listening to it.
Not necessarily a good memory, you're saying?
Not a good memory for people responsible for ensuring the safety of their apps and everything's patched and up to date.
Well, I remember that, but I wonder, was it legit? All that fear, like, was really the internet on fire back then?
There's certainly a lot of mainstream and plenty of corners of the internet touched by this, but we're going to find out today how things really were and how things have shaped up since. And we have actually this is going to be a two-part session, Marco, which I'm really cool to do with our friends at Imperva. And the first part of the series is with Gabby Staple, and we're going to get into some research she and the team have done, and then we're going to go on continue the conversation in a second round with Peter Klimek, and he'll hopefully correct my pronunciation of his name when he comes on at some point. But we're gonna take a stroll back in memory lane. We're gonna look at the river of what is known as the internet and how Log4j kind of messed with app dev and DevOps and DevSecOps.
Let's see it's the metaphor, Sean. Let's see if that log actually created a dam and now it's floating still all over the places, of just like flowing to the water in the ocean.
Are we going to bring security beavers into the
security beavers? Yeah, well, never know. No, right now we're not bringing that. I think now it's time to introduce our guest, as you already kind of tease on that one.
He's been sitting by patiently as we tell our stupid jokes and
watching the water go by.
That's right, Gabby. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Sean and Marco. I love the log reference. This is a great idea. Security beavers.
That's right. That's right. We chew our way through patches.
Oh, for sure.
So, Gabby, before we get into all the nuts and bolts of what happened, tell us about your role at Imperva and some of the things you do related to this and otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Gabby. I am the content manager for Imperva's threat research team. So I work really closely with the security teams and the analysts and those who are doing the hands-on research, and work with them to figure out what's going on and get that out to the public.
And that's an easy job, I'm sure. Not much going on to report on.
In
the world of security.
Never.
No. All right, so let's reel back the film a bit, and I don't know, when was the event? What is it? A specific moment in time? Was it a period of days or weeks that things kind of came to fruition for Log4j? Give us the backstory there.
Yeah, so December 2021 was when all of this really reached a head, and it was a huge deal. I mean, you talk about it, setting the internet on fire and whether or not it was overhyped. I mean, it definitely lived up to the hype in the days immediately following its release and its exposure into the internet. Back in December of 2021, we saw really huge attack numbers when it hit the news. And within 3 days, we were seeing about 5.5 million attacks per day. And at its peak, about 25,000 sites attacked per hour, which is huge numbers. Yeah.
So clearly a lot of sites attacked.
Yeah.
Any info on whether the attackers knew which sites were vulnerable? I mean, we can all turn to Shodan to see who's running what for most things, but how well informed were the adversaries in this respect?
Yeah, so originally we saw early on in this attack, we saw a lot of scanning and checking to see which is vulnerable, those sort of attacks. And then really quickly, I mean, this was automated, and we saw that based on the combination of the volume of attacks and the distribution of web clients that we were seeing, that this was automated really quickly, and attack tools were created to make it easy for attackers to reach as many targets as possible within just a couple days of it being launched.
So, but was this,
go ahead,
sorry, Sean, I'm curious, because was this like something that somehow could have been expected? I mean, was it like lingering? Was it like some signals that something was going to go on, or was it just like, just exploded all at once?
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much just exploded. I mean, obviously with open source software, and I mean, anything really, there's always the chance that there could be some critical vulnerability in there. And just as soon as this was released, and as soon as there was a POC created, I mean, people were really quick to jump on this and use this as an attack vector.
So open source software, I presume anybody who had to deal with this already knows what's involved, but for those maybe who are using open source software and maybe something that's leveraging this bit of code that didn't have to deal with it back then, what's the likelihood of them actually using something that's vulnerable at this point?
I mean, remediation is super hard with with Log4j, and that's something that Peter's going to talk about more. But there was a study in October that showed that at that point, 72% of organizations still had some level of vulnerability to Log4j, just because of the depth that this hit, and I mean how prevalent Java is and how prevalent this was. So I mean, whether or not that they've dealt with it at that point, it's pretty easy to say that everyone's going to have to figure something out to deal with Log4j at some point, just because of the prevalence and the vulnerability.
How about the news? Before we go more into the detail, because sometimes I feel like it gets in the news and it gets worse instead of getting better, especially when it's a cyber attack, because I almost feel like, do you want to just keep it quiet while we resolve this issue, if we can, or as much as we can resolve this issue? So how do you feel like the news responded to this in a professional way? Were they interviewing the right people? Was they creating more problem than what it really in the end could have been?
Well, I think that the awareness that was created around this vulnerability, and the public campaigns that were used, I mean, I think that really helped, because people were aware of the threat that was out there, and rather than this sliding under the radar, people were really quick to jump on it and to do what they needed to do to defend their systems.
And before we get into some of the mitigation opportunities, if you will, I'll call them opportunities, what were some of the impacts that were possible? Describe the scenario of a vulnerable Log4j component is scanned and identified by a bad actor, and then what's the impact to the business?
So we saw a couple different kinds of payloads in these attacks. One of them was probing, obviously, just checking to see if the application was vulnerable and seeing what they could do with it. Reverse shells, and then malware deployment, those were a big one. And then a really interesting one that we saw actually was patching via payload. So it was definitely a non-standard way to patch these systems, but running Java code in these payloads that changed the configuration and disallowing lookups. So people were figuring out how to patch the Log4j vulnerability with Log4j payloads, which obviously was not the preferred way of patching or anything like that, but it was a really unique and interesting way that people were figuring out how to solve this problem.
So applications obviously live in a different world than, say, a database, right? Yeah. Hopefully the database isn't exposed like an application is to the internet. Does that include all applications, or I'm just wondering, are there systems that are vulnerable that aren't exposed externally, but that may be exposed internally to bad actors? Insider threats are an issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything that's running this this log4j version of Java lookup, I mean, could theoretically be exposed or vulnerable to log4shell if it's not properly patched and mitigated.
Are there any other noticeable trends surrounding this? So you mentioned some of the payloads. Did you see a spike in before or after events?
Absolutely. So some of the really interesting things to me, one, you mentioned spikes in December of 2022, so a year after, and I mentioned early on that there was these huge numbers, and then by March of 2022, it had kind of fell to about 500,000 requests per day, so about 500,000, and that's pretty much what it's stayed at. And then in December of 2022, we saw these huge spikes again, which is kind of funny because it almost seems like attackers were celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Log4j by going and trying to use it again. But yeah, so there was some huge spikes in December of 2022, a year later. And then some other interesting things that really stood out to me were that even though Log4j was this huge attack, within 3 months of release, so by March, attacks were down to about 500,000 a day. And that was actually 1/6 of the attack request numbers of Shellshock, which is a vulnerability that's almost a decade old. So even though Log4j was much newer, by the time the newness and the popularity sort of waned off, and because of these public campaigns and awareness, it was they weren't as able to use it, and so they were falling back on tried and true attack methods.
So looking back now, could have been handled differently? Is it going to help what happened with all the problem that came with it? Are we learning as an industry, as professional, and as businesses? And I know we'll go more into the business part later, but you as a researcher, I mean, I'm sure you've been monitoring what has been going on. So what's the expectation now?
Yeah, I mean, Log4j definitely taught us a lot about the impact of supply chain security, and definitely how hard vulnerabilities can be to truly mitigate at the end of the day. And so I think that it's been a really good case study, and we've definitely learned a lot from it. And I think it'll help us when things like this come down the pipe again, because obviously vulnerabilities are always going to be out there, and it's always going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. But I think this has been a good example of how to respond, especially in the news and in the public. And Peter will get into more of that, I'm sure. But I think it's been a really good case study and a good example of how to react, and will help us do things faster next time.
And did something follow on the dark side because of that? So somebody was like, hey, if we can do this, maybe we can do that. So any new problem but connected, and any new vulnerability connected to that one?
Yeah, not that I've seen.
So nothing's seen there, but I'm wondering how customers might look for things. So as a researcher, you have the luxury of seeing a lot of things from a lot of sensors from a lot of places to kind of tip you off. I'm wondering, are there any triggers that organizations might look for signs of bad activity or unusual activity that maybe is specific to Log4j that could tip them off for something else that might happen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily Log4j specific, but one of the big things that I've also seen from Log4j is that, I mean, anything that's web application can also impact APIs as well. And so API security is a big one for Log4j also, because we saw about 15% of the total attacks that we were seeing were targeting APIs as well. And so I think that APIs are sort of easy to turn into, shadow APIs or to be forgotten in the total cycle, but it's super important to protect those as well, and to not forget that anything out there in the security atmosphere like Log4j, like these big vulnerabilities that drop, can also target your APIs as well, and not to let that be an access vector for attackers.
And in terms of selecting APIs and using open source code, I'm just wondering, are there any tips or tricks we should be looking at as we're building these things?
Just making sure that they're monitored and that they're maintained. I mean, obviously when they sort of fall off the wayside and aren't kept up, they can turn into shadow APIs, and then they can be forgotten, and that's a huge a huge security issue. So just making sure that you have the proper documentation and you're checking on things like that.
I'm curious what other research and data that is interesting to app developers, ops folks, maybe those two groups specifically. Let's leave security out of it for a moment. What are some things that you're seeing that those two groups really should be aware of?
So I can speak to like the Log4j data that I've seen. So like I said, we're seeing about 500,000 attack requests per day, and about 7% of those are successful or would be successful. 12% of all CVE requests total since December 21 are Log4j related. So it's taking up a big share of the CVE attack market, obviously. We've seen attacks primarily on sites based in the US, Spain, and the UK. Although it's targeting obviously all over the world, but those were the biggest numbers that we've seen. And then financial, business, and computing industries were the top 3 targets. And in API specifically, the financial industry accounted for almost 50% of the APIs that were under attack. So that's a big target for this Log4j. And then the biggest clients that we've seen, 75% of attacks come from either bots or Chrome.
That's interesting. So you mentioned it earlier, a lot of automated attacks.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting point, I think, because you said around 3/4 of instances aren't patched, right? Only 25% have patched or something like that. 75% or some 70s.
Yeah, as of this
unpatched.
study in October, 72% of organizations still had some sort of vulnerability.
Right. So we as an industry and as a professional practitioner in security haven't figured out a way to automate patching, right? That's what that says. Yet the bad actors have found a way to automate attacks.
Yeah, it's definitely hard.
Yeah. So how, I don't know, obviously Imperva does some really good things, which we'll talk with Peter about, I suspect, on how to protect against this, even without patching, to kind of eliminate the need to automate patching altogether, perhaps. But how do you suggest, as an industry, we get ahead of this?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's definitely hard. I mean, the study showed that those organizations, the 72% that were still vulnerable, they'd pretty much all been mitigated at some point. And then it's just as you're downloading new assets and as you're incorporating new things into your structure, there's some level of vulnerability that's going to be included in that. So, I mean, obviously Peter's going to talk more about this, but documentation and just making sure that you're really up on remediation and you're really checking the new things that you're adding as well, because you can be completely remediated, but if you add something that has some level of vulnerability, then you've ruined that whole system. So just making sure that you're checking these things and you're documenting them.
So if you have to summarize what the overall impact of this instance, and then the I'm going to call it the birthday one, the one that came, the wave that came after, like comparing what happened at the time and the fact that it somehow is still going on, a lot of unpatched situation. I mean, how would you summarize this? Like, what's the lesson learned from all of these? You mentioned there are many lessons that we've learned from this, but can you give me some example of how actually Imperva has implemented some of this solution and overall, what's your feeling as a researcher? What's to come?
Yeah, I mean, Log4j, like I said, definitely taught us a lot about the impact of this supply chain security issue. And I think that the public awareness that was created around this, I mean, people were really quick to jump on the problem. And even if it wasn't a lasting solution, because like I said, as you're incorporating new assets, sometimes that can break remediation. But people were really quick to jump on it, and Imperva included, and creating solutions really early on and making sure that those were available and out there. That's really important. And I think there's a couple things to learn from it. One, obviously Peter's going to talk more about this, but remediation is not a one and done solution. Like I said, Log4j was an instance where organizations would fix the problem and then it would come right back due to the prevalence of the software and how deep it went. So I just want to flag that point. And then also, like I said, API security is super important, because I mean, 15% of the numbers were coming from the APIs. And so that's an important attack vector to be aware of and to prevent.
Well, it sounds like we've learned a lot. And as you were talking, all I could think about was, and I hate to even say this, but boosters, Log4j boosters, because this stuff, I mean, there's a new version of Log4j, new version of APIs that we're using all the time. And
yeah,
so similar to it's not a one and done protection solution. We need to understand that new things come along as well, kind of to your point there. So sounds like a great deal of information in the research that you have, and hopefully folks will take a look at some of the stuff you've done, and we'll connect with you and the rest of the Imperva team.
Absolutely.
To understand what's going on with Log4j and all the other logs that are floating down the river.
Security beavers out there.
That's right. That's right. And of course, we're gonna keep this conversation going. And in the next episode, we're gonna have a chance to chat with Peter, who has a different slice of, I'll say, research, more from the other side of the app, right? And so you're seeing how things are being attacked and how exposed they are and how vulnerable the internet is. And Peter's going to look at this from inside to see how we're spotting things and shoring up the walls to help protect these apps.
Sounds like you're saying that, Peter, it's actually in the water, and and see things from the inside, and how the business are actually reacting to that, and how Imperva is helping them. So I'm actually really grateful for this conversation, and I'm excited to hear the other side of things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean and Marco.
Well, thank you very much.
And for everybody listening, stay tuned for that next one, and be sure to check the show notes for links to Imperva and Gabby's profile and other resources that are related to Log4j and other things API security. We'll see you on the next one.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and the story made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.